Okay, and this video is the first for budgetary policy, and we're going to be looking at what Chapter 9 is all about, which is the nature and operation of budgetary policy. So the idea of Unit 4 is basically separated into two different components. We look at how both aggregate demand and aggregate supply policies work together to try and improve domestic economic stability. Remember, whenever you hear that word, it's three-pronged. It means strong and sustainable growth, low inflation, and full employment. So domestic economic stability or internal stability just mean full employment, strong and sustainable growth, and low inflation. So the idea of these demand and supply side policies is to improve domestic economic stability and improve our overall prosperity or living standards. The budgetary policy refers to the anticipated changes. So it's an estimate in May of each year. It's an estimate of the future revenues and expenditures for the government in the next financial year. So from July to June, as well as estimates for several years after. So budgetary policy is an estimate of the changes in revenues and expenditures for the next financial year and the years after that. The overall aim of the budget, which is announced in May each year, or the overall aim of fiscal policy, is to achieve each of the three goals that we studied last semester, so full employment, strong and sustainable growth, and low inflation, with the overall aim of the budget to improve the welfare or living standards of society and achieve the most efficient allocation of resources. So the overall aim or overriding objective of budgetary policy is to improve the welfare or living standards of society or achieve a more efficient allocation of resources. These are all intermediate goals designed to achieve that overriding goal or aim. So the three macroeconomic goals, just as a recap, strong and sustainable growth is the fastest growth in national production. Again, growth is about production. You want to talk about production every time you're talking about growth. Around 3% or a little higher, that does not jeopardise the achievement of other economic or environmental goals, like external stability or inflation. The goal of full employment, the lowest unemployment of around 5% of the labour force, that does not accelerate inflation. And no cyclical unemployment, and the goal of low inflation, and again, people need to work on their definitions of low inflation. It's a slow average rise in general consumer prices of 2 to 3% a year over the economic cycle. This bit here, people are being reluctant to do. They're not mentioning consumer prices, and they're not mentioning 2 to 3% over the business or economic cycle. So do that in your answers. Okay, the role of budgetary policy as a demand policy, and that's what we're going to look at in this chapter. How is budgetary policy used as a demand side factor? Macroeconomic demand management policies aim to regulate the level of aggregate demand. So the idea of these demand side policies is to stabilise the level of economic activity or the business cycle. Stability in the business cycle should help to create the economic conditions that we want, so domestic economic stability, which will allow us to achieve our other three goals of strong and sustainable growth, full employment, and low inflation. Demand management policies, such as budgetary policy, aim to eliminate volatility. They work in a counter-cyclical manner, which means that if you're in a trough, they try and boost growth. If we're in a peak, they try and slow the economy down. So that aggregate demand is sort of in line with our supply potential. So we know supply moves in sort of a linear fashion. Demand moves in sort of a curvy fashion. The idea of budgetary and monetary policy is to get demand sort of more linear so that it's going up consistently in line with aggregate supply. That should help to avoid rises in inflation or significant increases in unemployment when we have really slow growth. So the idea of budgetary policy, if we're in a peak, and we'll talk about this more in future videos, or a trough, is they will regulate economic activity. So in a peak, we may increase taxes to slow economic growth. Automatic stabilisers will work to try and decrease growth as well. And in a trough, automatic stabilisers should work to try and pick up growth, as well as discretionary stabilisers to try and slow the economy down. And we'll look at that in future videos. So the idea of budgetary policy is to avoid short-term volatility. The importance of budgetary policy is regarded as the key macroeconomic or demand-side policy because changes in the level of government revenue and expenditure have a powerful effect on total expenditure and national production. The budget or budget revenues and expenses equate to around 25% of our GDP. So our GDP is around 1.6 trillion. The government collects around a quarter of that, so 400 billion in revenue. So it has a big impact on national production and prices. The budget is just an estimate and may change due to weaker economic growth, higher unemployment, falls in the terms of trade, global economic slowdowns, and a whole range of other things that can impact the size of the budget from one year to the next. The government's fiscal strategy can change between one budget and the next, and it's basically the idea of the fiscal strategy is to show how the government intends to promote the prosperity of Australians. How do they intend to use the budget to maximise society's living standards? And it's basically like their plan of attack, which we'll talk about later on. Thank you.